Hello, and welcome to the Faith Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 17th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of September 15th, 2024, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig in this week's podcast, and I'm excited for a couple different reasons this week. This week is the 350th consecutive week of the Faith and Science Podcast. That's crazy for me to think about, that we have been doing this that long, that we've hit 350. So congratulations to us that we've been able to do this. It's amazing. It's been a long journey. We'll get into that later this week. There is a special podcast that I'm planning on dropping, so keep an eye out for it later this week, talking about a little bit of some of the stuff with the Faith and Science Podcast. 350 episodes. Might give a little bit of what's kind of going on with a few different things, but we'll see where that goes. I like those kind of being a little bit free-flowing, and we'll see what that brings. But happy 350th consecutive week to the Faith and Science Podcast. It's been a long ride, and I hope you've enjoyed it along the way. I'm also really excited that, again, we are in the season. There's a lot going on, but I think we need to look back to last week's question, which was, where do we need to continue to evolve and change for the healing of everyone? And I think it gets into a lot of some of the discussion that we've had before, but I think one of the answers that we got back this week was talking about how we have to be able to be true to who we are. We have to be able to be in a safe space to be able to allow ourselves to be really, truly who we are. And I think there's another part of that is, in order for us to truly be who we are, we have to allow ourselves to understand whose we are. And in that process of understanding whose we are, we need to make sure we spend that time with that whose. And I think that understanding and spending time with God and recognizing that God is not constrained to the boxes that sometimes we put ourselves into, hint, hint for this week, I think at times it can free us and allow us to feel more emboldened to actually be who we are. And I think that is a major part of this life, is us trying to become the best version of ourselves. And sometimes that's very hard. Sometimes that's very difficult. Sometimes that means reaching out and stepping out in ways that we don't necessarily feel comfortable with. But allowing us to continue to make that step allows us to continue to be more of who we are called to be at these different times and at these different spaces. So I think that's a huge aspect of this that I think is really important as we are looking and moving forward with things. So let's just jump into it this week. One of the Old Testament texts this week that you have to choose from is from Proverbs chapter 1, verses 20 to 33. This is an interesting little text here discussing how wisdom is out there for us. It's the question of, are we actually listening for it? Or are we being foolish and feeling like that we have the understanding of what is going on and ignoring the knowledge and hating the knowledge of the wisdom that is coming from the Lord? That how often it is that we can get in our own way, that we feel that we have our own understanding, we have a way that's going to take care of this, and yet the wisdom of God, the ways that God is continuing to try to reach out to us, sometimes we bat aside or put to the side so that we can press on our own way. And it's sometimes making it more difficult instead of us listening to the wisdom of the one who has been around much longer than us. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 19, all 14 verses of it. And so this is then kind of building upon that idea. If we are understanding and recognizing that we are at times missing the wisdom of God, then we need to continue to be looking for it and recognizing where it is all around us. Recognizing that it's in the firmament all around us, but this is part of the love letter. This is part of the bringing together us with God's creation, us being part of this thing, recognizing the gift that we have been given and acknowledging it and being able to be true to it and try to be as true to that bridegroom with this gift that we have been given. Recognizing that we are going to fall short, but do our best to not fall short. And that's a very difficult task, a very tall task, but something that takes a lifetime plus for us to really fully get. The other alternative Old Testament text this week, first reading, is from Isaiah chapter 54, verses 4 to 9a. This will play into something we'll get here more in the second reading, but recognizing how the tongue sometimes can be something that needs to be tamed. And on top of that, then with us taming the tongue, being open to hearing what God is saying to us. And in doing that, being able to recognize the wisdom that God has around us, being able to hear it, acknowledge it, and soak it all in. And I think that's the thing that sometimes is very difficult for us. There is things that are going to be very hard, very difficult in that we are going to feel that is not going to be easy. There's going to be heartaches because of that. But in doing these things, we recognize that God is stronger than this, and we have a deeper faith from it. There are two different kind of alternatives. You also have the alternative this week of the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7, verse 26 to chapter 8, verse 1. So this is then this recognition on how we are looking for the image of God around us, recognizing that the Spirit of God is around us, and we are consistently looking for that wisdom, looking for that guiding force within us. And in that, the beauty that comes from that, the beauty of being able to spend time with that, helps us be able to connect further, but also acknowledge the wisdom and the beauty that is all around us. Alternatively, we have Psalm 116, the first 9 verses that go with that. And this then is a psalm of recognizing that we are turning our ear toward God, that we are trying to walk with God, that we are giving our life to God and recognizing that the Lord is righteous and merciful and protects us in doing this, that He continues to rise us up and humble those who need to be humbled. It's that spending time with the Lord that we recognize and can become more like who God is calling us each to be, and being able to walk more and more as the image of who God is wanting all of us to walk in. The epistle text or second reading this week is out of James chapter 3, the first 12 verses of it. And this plays into a little bit of that Isaiah text earlier, that this is something that we then need to make sure that we are watching what we say. We need to bridle the tongue. We need to make sure that we are trying to steer our ship in the right direction. And sometimes we can get caught up in ourselves. Sometimes we can get caught up in our own words. Sometimes the tongue can be a restless evil full of deadly poison, coming from verse 8. This recognition on how it can be something that both builds up and also tears down. So this thing of how we need to be able to caress it, work with it, and recognize and be careful with it is something that is going to help bring life. And I think it also plays into a little bit of what we'll get into here a little bit with the gospel text this week. The gospel text then is out of Mark chapter 8, verses 27 to 38. This is a very familiar part of Scripture, and it's something that I find very interesting that we're actually getting a bigger part of the story this week. Jesus is with his disciples in the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and he asks, "Who do people say that I am?" And so they're responding. Some say John the Baptist, Elijah, other prophets. And then Jesus asks a different question, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter responds with, "You are the Messiah." And then is ordered to not say anything, very similar to like last week. And Jesus then starts going into foretelling his death and is talking quite openly about this. Peter then takes him aside and be like, "What are you doing? This is not what you should be doing." He gets rebuked. "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." And Jesus then goes back out to the crowd. "If you wish to come and follow me, deny themselves, pick up their cross and follow me." And this whole idea of how we have to lose ourselves to gain our life. This whole idea of the following in what Jesus is saying is not necessarily going to make straight logical sense. There are some things that are going to be hard to fully grasp and get our head around, but yet this is going to steer us in this better direction. And that's kind of where we leave it. So we have this moment of Peter being lifted, and look, he proclaims it, and within it seems minutes is being ridiculed for not understanding what really is going on. So before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do a shameless plug. Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their sermon brainwaves, podcasts, or commentaries to discussions, since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, direction, ways to think about these texts in a different way. There's some great biblical scholars over there, and so if you haven't checked that out, along with their amazing archive of the Working Preacher podcast, I'd highly recommend it. There is some great resources over there. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but also having the art, prayers, hymns, liturgical colors, and even a daily devotion can be extremely helpful. Remember, a major part of what we are trying to do here is prepare for worship and making sure that we all are prepared, whether you are in front of the congregation or part of the congregation. And I think that's where this type of text, being able to go through this and work through this, is extremely important. So if you haven't checked out Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend it. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter that goes through a wide variety of resources going into ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies to be able to bring into your preaching, along with the different ideas to look at more of an eco-friendly faith theology. If you are enjoying listening to this podcast week after week, I really highly recommend checking out these resources. They will be down in the show notes, the first links down there. This week, in order for us to really get into what is Jesus really getting at here with, I would argue, who do you say that I am? What do others say that I am? I think we need to understand a little bit of some basic biological categorization. Basically the Dewey Decimal System of the scientific, specifically though, the biological world. And that is phylogeny. Now, phylogeny is basically taking and making evolutionary trees on how did these different creatures, these different organisms potentially evolve. Can we find common ancestors where they potentially branched off? Being able to understand that type of tree allows us to go into more taxonomy, which is then labeling and organizing and categorizing these organisms. Then that gets into the different types of taxa, which we've talked about, but just as a quick reminder, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. These being able to help get us to more precise, being able to have more common ancestors closer to them, being able to better understand and maybe being able to better hypothesize what are some of the different attributes that would different animals or different organisms would have. Now, this has often been done off of physical attributes, but like many things, there are many problems with this. For example, there is one family for the ants family. There are 12,000 species that are under the family of ants. But instead of breaking that off into multiple families, we decided we should just have one family for ants. And so thus, between the genus and species, we have 12,000. A little bit crazy there, but I figured that was an easy example to show where, yes, there is some problems with it, but it doesn't just stop there. There is some semantics that we sometimes run into, and that's how do we organize these organisms? And when we're looking at these common ancestors, then we're typically looking for traits that are very similar, and allowing us to be able to then have better hypothesis and being able to better understand who are and where do we evolve some of these different traits and attributes? But we sometimes can be deceived. As we've talked about before, you can have coevolution where different things evolve at a separate time, or you have something like analogous traits, which is something that appears to be similar, but it's actually quite different. So for instance, taking like the giant pandas, they seem to have like a thumb-like appendage to help them with eating bamboo. When we actually do the scans, the x-rays of their paws, it's a modification off the wrist bone, which is very different than us in the primate family, that we have our own appendage that is a thumb. It's not a modified wrist bone. So yes, do they both look like thumbs? Yes. Are they very different? Also yes. And so this can sometimes make it very difficult for us to be able to create these hypotheses of these phylogenetic trees. And in doing that, when we are looking at and including some of these different animals and organisms into these trees, it can also sometimes make it very hard to be able to group them together. So we try, but it still can be very difficult. So when you're taking in a group where it's like, well, let's look at this common ancestor and all the relatives of that, it's called a clade. Now, this can be extremely helpful. Like when you're looking at, take for instance, bears, it can be really great to look at most of the world's bears all fall into the same clade. And so it's like, okay, we know that this common ancestor is kind of the linkage for all these different bears. But it also can be very difficult. So like for instance, if we take the red panda, which for years we associated with the bears, it's closely related to raccoons. So do you want to include your raccoons in your bear family? I don't typically think of a raccoon as a type of bear. Another example is like, and I'll attach a video down below. I thought SciShow did a great job with this, talking about we like categorizing things with broad brush strokes, such as fish. Okay, where do you draw the line? Are dolphins a fish or not? And when you start going through taking, okay, I'm going to say the goldfish is my standard for a fish, you start going through the history, it's not that far off from how we understand the evolutionary history here, that a beaver isn't that far removed from a goldfish because it became a tetrapod, but there's a lot of common ancestors that a goldfish would have with a beaver. So do you want to consider a beaver a fish? If you do, that also means we're a fish because we're also then off that same phylogenetic branch that a beaver would be on because we kind of walked out of the water. So this is where some of this stuff can get really confusing. And on top of that, then you can get into how we're getting into speciation based off of evolutionary hierarchy, or do you want to get more into ecological speciation, which is taking into more of the environmental conditions? Do you want to take into where physical locations have caused speciation? So for instance, like the Grand Canyon separating the Albert squirrel and the Kaibab squirrel genetically are very similar, but yet they have been separated for so long. At what point does speciation happen? And we still have even had some issues with DNA. Taking, for instance, the tuatara, which is a lizard in the South Pacific. There is the Brothers Island and the northern tuatara, and for years they were seen as the same. Then in 1990, when we did some genetic research on them as, oh no, those are two separate species, we redid genetic testing in 2008 and decided, no, they're not enough for genetic differences. And so thus, we get into these weird limbos. At what point is something speciated? At what point do we separate this off? At what point do we say this is something different, or this is different than this, or I can't agree with you on this? And take even, for instance, geese. You have Canadian geese, but then you have subspecies, various different subspecies, and we've also even broken off crackling geese as a separate thing here in North America. And I would argue, yes, the difference is physical size, a little bit different in the call, but it also is somewhat hard to, at a quick glance, be able to necessarily, with confidence, be able to tell the difference between them. What does any of this have to do with what Jesus is talking about? What I would argue is this is exactly what Peter is going through. Peter is able to initially hear in verse 29 in the gospel text say, "You are the Messiah. That's who you are." Great. And we are able to put name to that. We are able to acknowledge that. But the problem is when Jesus then starts talking about what that actually means in verse 31. Peter takes him aside in verse 32. Why? Because that doesn't fit the box that Peter has for God. That doesn't fit the box of what Peter is assuming the Messiah should look like. This is not that much different than when we're going through and trying to make these phylogenetic trees. And yes, they're helpful. Yes, it helps inform us to understand how these things work. But they're also a crutch in the same way, because where is the line? There isn't this clear line on what makes a species. We have some of these arbitrary rules, and I'll even attach a link down below where there is discussion saying we need clear rules on what makes a species a species. Jesus is laying out what it means to actually be the Messiah, and Peter is struggling like we do with the definition of what that means. Peter is seeing, like what James is talking about, that the tongue is going crazy, and instead, Peter then decides to use his tongue to try to bridle Jesus. And that doesn't exactly go well. The wisdom of what Jesus is trying to lay out, the wisdom of what Jesus is trying to show and get us prepared for, we completely miss. And how much was that talked about in our Old Testament texts in various forms this week? We have to be open to change, like we talked about last week, for the healing of us. But it also means in our evolving understanding of who God is and the evolving understanding and allowing change to happen means that we have the possibility then of actually expanding and growing our understanding of who God is. The more that we are able to understand and spend time out in God's creation and expand our understanding of what this all actually means, allows us to grow in our understanding of the essence of who God is and growing closer to God. Here's another video I'll attach down below that I'd highly recommend checking out, but there is a point here that I think is also good for us to think about. We've talked about phylogenetic trees and being able to build these things off. Within the plant world, you would think there would be a whole section that are trees. And if you make that assumption, you are 100% wrong. There is nothing that defines and clearly defines something as a tree. Because the problem is what we have found, especially with plants, is that plants, the difference is that you have some of these plants that just decided to grow taller. And in doing that, evolve different ways of being able to continue to reproduce, different ways to be able to track things to be pollinated, different ways to be able to get competitive advantages. And I'll attach some fun links down below talking about some of that stuff. But something that in our mind is so easy to categorize is not that simple. And I think this is part of this reminder here. And as we are in the beginning of the fall season, I think it's something that's really important as a body for us to remember. The moment that we start to simplify Jesus is the moment that we have also lost what it actually means to be following Jesus. We have to remember that this is so much bigger than what we can fully understand, and we're trying to grab pieces of it. We're trying to piece this thing together. If we acknowledge a creation that took a period of time, multiple days to centuries, depending on where you're at, either way, you have to acknowledge that this is not something that is easily just immediately grasped, that this is something that's complex. And if you spend any time going through and talking with somebody who studies ecosystems, they will explicitly tell you how complex these systems are, and we have gone through that multiple times before in these podcasts. That's why it's also so difficult for us to be able to try to make phylogenetic trees of what the taxonomy of these different animals are and being able to just clearly link them all together. Because even when we've gotten into the DNA, there's still times we make mistakes. And I think that continues to remind us that we can't put God into a box. And I think that is an important message for us to remember. In the busy worlds in which we're in, how often we try to put God into a box. We try to put the environment into a box. We try to put this part of our life into a box. And that's not how we were designed. We are designed to be interacting and creating and being part of something much greater. Being part of a canvas that we're all part of. And if we aren't allowing ourselves to do that, we're missing out. So the question I have for you this week is, where are you boxing God? Where are you boxing God? Maybe it's a physical fight like in boxing, the sport, or maybe it's that there's moments where you start thinking about this and it's like, I've kind of put a limitation there on God. Because I'd argue those times when we actually start to recognize that and actually try working on that is when we really start moving in a new direction, in a new way within our faith. That's exciting and it's an invigorating thing. We recognize it and see it with young people of the faith, of their eyes light up as they understand and grasp a new part of it, and it provides a new hunger to try to keep understanding more. Keep understanding more knowledge and how do more of this stuff come together, recognizing how complicated it is, but yet also how beauty is in that complexity, yet the message is so simple. Naming the creation is something that we like doing because we like putting a box on it. We like naming it because then it gives us a sense of ownership, and it gives us a sense of purpose, and it gives us a sense that we can fight for those things. And we've talked about that in years past. But I think it's also a thing that hinders us. The tuatara, we can't decide, is it one species or is it two species? Where is the line of speciation? How about hybrids? That's a whole nother conversation. Where do they fit in this? I think these are things that we have to continue to ponder and think about and allow ourselves the possibility to be surprised. Allow ourselves the possibility to see that the creation in which we are placed isn't always as black and white as we'd like it. But in the beauty of that it's not black and white, there is more colors to the palette then that God is able to work in those shades of white and black. There's a lot of shades of gray. Peter tried making it black and white. And I think Jesus showed him that no, that was not the way you were cutting it to be black and white, is not the way that it was intended to be. And I think there's a lot there that we can learn from. It doesn't mean that we still don't try to categorize species. There's value to it. But I think then we also have to allow ourselves the possibility to continue to be surprised, continue to be in awe, and continue to see that these connections that we have sometimes are really complicated. And there's a beauty to that as well. Allow the beauty to come in. Allow the beauty to show. And allow the complexity of what God has created be what it is and be part of it as the amazing being that you are as well. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.